Dr. Gawne is going to speak to us about the cursed crew of Taubmans and Quayles. Thank you very much.
The inevitable glass of water. Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome everybody this morning. The Isle of Man in the 18th century was a perfect place to be if you wanted to be part of a number of new enterprising ventures. And my talk this morning will focus on some of the people who were deeply involved in the whole thing. They include two Lords of Man, the 3rd Duke of Atholl and his son, the 4th Duke, Sir George Moore, chairman of the self-elected House of Keys, members of the powerful and prosperous Taubman and Quayle families, and in particular, influential members of the House of Keys. In the latter half of the 17th century, Britain had brought into force various navigation and trade acts to finance and protect its own imperial endeavours overseas. Customs duties on certain foreign luxury goods were high. Consequently, the Lords of Man realised that the island could afford to heavily undercut the customs duties of its neighbouring countries, and as a consequence, made a considerable amount of revenue for the family's exchequer. The island's position, physically and constitutionally, made it a prime base for receiving bulk cargoes of luxury goods, paying the low Manx customs duties, and repacking the goods into smaller containers. Some goods were brought directly to the island from abroad, and others were legally shipped here from Britain, their owners having been refunded the higher British customs duties that they had previously paid. All this was perfectly legal. But the next action was when the legal trade turned into the smuggling trade. Vessels loaded with contraband sailed out of the island, with their crew intent on evading the revenue cutters and landing in secluded parts of the coastline of England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland without paying any duties at the customs houses. Local people then assisted in unloading the smuggled goods and putting them onto pack horses to be taken by armed gang along secluded tracks and across moorlands to the customers' stores. As many Manx farmers and crofters were becoming involved in the lucrative smuggling trade, some of them were giving up their land tenures. The money made from a small amount of low-risk smuggling far outweighed the pittance made from working the fields. And they were happy, and they were unhappy with the way their ancient tenures were being dealt with. Indeed, in 1703, the Keys sent 3 of their members, Ewan Christian of Milltown, his relative another Ewan Christian of Luaig, and John Stevenson of Balladule. They were sent to England to meet James Stanley, the 10th Earl. In consultation with Bishop Wilson, the Earl arranged for an act to be passed by Tynwald in 1704 to restore the ancient customary inheritance from father to son. The Keys were importantly instrumental in resolving this long-standing grievance. Yes. In 1736, James Stanley, the 10th Earl of Derby, died childless. The suzerainty of the Isle of Man passed to James Murray, the 2nd Duke of Atholl, and heir as great-grandson through the female line of the 7th Earl of Derby. The years which followed James Murray becoming the Lord of Man were without doubt the greatest period in Manx maritime trading history. It cannot be overemphasised just how great the annual volume and value of goods being brought into and out of the island's ports were. Thousands of tons in weight of goods and millions of pounds in monetary worth at today's prices. And the Manx customs duties were very low. In 1737, the import duty on French wine into Britain was 4 shillings and 3pence a pint. In the island, it was just a halfpenny. An incredible 100 times less. Smugglers became bolder and more resourceful. If the vessels were met by revenue cruisers in the St George's Channel and boarded and rummaged by the officials, the masters were well prepared with ploys to extricate themselves from whatever circumstances. Some surreptitiously dropped their goods overboard in bundles with floating markers to be retrieved later. Some, who came from the south, claimed to be bound for ports in the north, and those from the north inevitably claimed to be heading for ports in the south. To support their claims, they produced fictitious bills of lading, letters of instruction, and bills of consignment. Other masters blamed the weather for their wrong position. As soon as the revenue cruisers left, the ships continued on their way to the Isle of Man. In 1744, James Moss, a one-time army deserter, gave evidence in Castle Rushen on the murder and wounding of several people by William Owen. The smuggler and outlaw Owen was on the run from the authorities and had been sheltering in his vessel in Cardigan Bay when Customs Officer James Phillips and some armed men, including the pressed Moss, boarded the vessel to arrest Owen and his crew. Owen brought them to a cabin, talked to them from behind its partly closed door, plied them with ale, and entreated them to leave, offering 10 guineas if they would do so. When they refused, he cried out, "We will not surrender, and so you may fire away!" Moss then saw Owen pick up a pistol. Deemsters Daniel Murray and John Taubman recorded that Moss, seeing him preparing to fire, asked the officer's liberty to shoot him through a hole, but the officer forbid him and said by no means, and so did several of the rest that were with him, upon which the said Owen immediately fired and killed Officer Phillips, which obliged the informant and the rest that were there with him to take up arms and fire down into the cabin, but Owen found means to evade their fire. Moss was slightly wounded in the skirmish, so was able to escape with the other survivors. Owen captured him and had him thrown into the forecastle and ordered his crew to set sail for the Isle of Man. He released Moss in Douglas, swore him upon the bread and salt, not to report the incident, and then sailed round to Peel, where his Manx wife was living, and from where he eventually disappeared before the authorities could arrest him. George Moore became a member of the House of Peace in 1755 and was their chairman from 1758 through to 1780. The term chairman would become speaker following Moore's retirement. He established an overseas trading business based in Peel and had 2 small sailing ships which regularly made the crossing to the West Indies, returned via the Straits of Gibraltar to trade in the Mediterranean with France and Spain, and then sailed back to Peel, where the low customs duties were duly paid. Moore's coopers had small wooden barrels and casks ready to split up the contents of the hogsheads, and pipes of alcohol and boxes and bags to take the contents of the chests of tea and tobacco. Scottish boatmen came to Peel to collect the goods and sailed back with them to isolated Scottish beaches or sea locks unlikely to be visited by the revenue men. Moore carefully avoided any risk of being accused of involvement in smuggling. Once the merchandise left the island, it became the property of the purchaser, and what happened to it from then on was not his responsibility. The seas around Britain were crowded with privateers, which were manned by desperate men, in many cases only to be distinguished from pirates by the letters of marque they carried from their respective governments. In 1760, a battle took place off the west coast of the Isle of Man between the French privateers led by Captain Francois Thureau and British warships led by Captain John Elliot. George Moore knew the smuggler and adventurer Thureau very well. Indeed, Thureau's African butler Douglas, had been More's slave servant. It was thought that Douro was on his way to the island to take hostages, including the Quay's chairman. James Murray, the second Duke of Atholl, died in 1764. His only surviving child, Lady Charlotte, Baroness Strange, succeeded him. She was married to her cousin, John Murray, who now became the third Duke of Atholl, as the male heir to the dukedom, and also became Lord of Man through his wife's succession. Married well, didn't he? So, the British government saw this as an opportunity to take action against the situation in the Isle of Man. Smuggling was rife. In 1765, Prime Minister George Grenville introduced the Mischief Bill into Parliament, which would empower English customs officers to search all ships for suspect duties, not only off the coast, but also in the Manx harbours. Whilst the members of the House of Keys initially had no knowledge of the proposals, news that the third Duke was involved in bargaining in London eventually reached them. Fearing that the interests of the island would be overlooked, they appointed two of their members, Hugh Cosnahan and Thomas More, to go to London to protect the island's constitutional and fiscal rights. However, a bargain between the British government and the Duke had already been sealed. Confused, depressed and unsure as to whether he was making the right decision, the Duke timorously informed the Treasury that his hopes was that neither your lordship nor the public will think the clear sum of £70,000 too great a price to be paid for us in full compensation. That £70,000 may not sound a lot now, but if you use a multiplying factor anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000, multiplies up to many millions of pounds. The resultant Revestment Act of the 10th of May 1765 returned the sovereignty, regalities and customs duties of the Isle of Man from the Lords of Man to the British Crown. The Mischief Act became effective 5 days later. The Revestment Act vested the island in His Majesty, his heirs and successors, thereby returning to the Crown the said island, castle, keel and lordship of Man. An official ceremony was held at Castle Rushen on the 11th of July. Soldiers led the procession of the captains of the garrisons, towns and parishes, the clergy, the members of the House of Keys, the Vicars General, the Archdeacon, the Deemsters and the Attorney General. The Constable of Castle Rushen carried 2 wooden boxes containing the Royal Proclamation and the Seal and the Governor's Commission. Finally came Governor John Wood. They all gathered in front of the Castletown Cross, where a crowd of people was waiting. No one in Britain had thought to have the proclamation written in Manx, the principal language of the people to whom it was to be addressed, so it had to be speedily translated and was now read out by John Quillen, the Attorney General. The Manx flag was struck, and the Union flag was hoisted in its place. Unsurprisingly, the last of the Atholl family to be Lord of Man was not present, but as representatives surrendered the island to the Crown by delivering the Sword of State and the public seal. But feelings of suspicion and foreboding would have been felt by many, and those who had prospered from smuggling must have despaired for their financial future. The Reverend Philip Moore, Bishop Mark Hildersley's colleague and friend, wrote to Hildersley, who was in England at the time, to inform him that nothing now but anarchy and confusion, ruled by customs, house officers, tide waiters and vinegar men. Bands of armed guards go about the country, terrifying the people and entering their houses in search of teas, etc. The Reverend Moore signed off, I have almost wrote myself sick. In April 1766, George Moore, chairman of the House of Keys, and Thomas More, MHK, were accompanied to London by the Reverend James Wilkes to put the case for improving the situation the Isle of Man was in. Later in the year, George Moore went alone to speak with the officials at the Treasury and the Customs, as well as other important individuals. The Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir George Cust, was most sympathetic and met with Chairman Moore on several occasions. Moore then presented various documents and memorials from the Keys to the Treasury, asking for concessions on trade and customs duties. But for week after week he sat ignored and kicking his heels in the cold antechambers of the Treasury without any outcome. Despite the sudden setback caused by revestment and the uncertainty of the future, the island soon came to terms with the financial consequences. Douglas in particular recovered rapidly due to the arrival of a variety of new residents, most of whom had moved to the island because of its cheap cost of living and less stringent laws on debtors, as well as its still comparatively low customs duties. Impoverished gentlefolk, escaping their creditors, minor noblemen of limited means, retired doctors, shopkeepers, and a variety of artisans, half-pay military officers, and other new residents found the island a financially beneficial and secure haven. Their influx gave an important impetus to the prosperity of the island as a whole. The third Duke of Atholl died in tragic circumstances in 1774, aged only 45, having suffered an apoplectic fit. He was being taken care of at his Dunkeld residence in the Scottish Highlands when he swallowed hartshorn, sulphate of ammonia, which was being used to bathe his forehead. He immediately began to bleed from his nose and mouth. Delirious and in great pain, he threw himself in the nearby River Tay and drowned. The Duchess Charlotte relinquished all her rights in the island by deed to their 19-year-old son, John Murray, the fourth Duke of Atholl. He blamed his father's mental state at the time of his unfortunate death, directly on the pressure brought on him by the British government, writing that, "While I live, I shall ever consider a noble heart was broken by a lamentable transaction." The fourth Duke petitioned the British Parliament in 1780, asking leave to introduce bills to protect his remaining rights in the island and to receive further compensation for his family's financial losses brought about by revestment. MHK's George Moore and John Costerhan gave evidence at the House of Lords against another petition in 1781, expressing their fear that any increased payment to the Duke would once again be at the expense of the people having to pay additional customs duties. The petition eventually passed the House of Commons, but was opposed in the House of Lords. In 1789, the Duke again renewed his claims. Amongst those opposing them was John Christian Curwen, a Whig MP from 1786, as well as an MHK from 1791, both at the same time, who met with Speaker John Taubman and MHK's Richard Stevenson and Daniel Callow in London in order to oppose the Duke. With a weight of opinion against him, the British government withdrew the bill, but the Duke continued to pressurise the authorities with a further claim in 1791, which was also unsuccessful. The fourth Duke of Atholl believed that the situation his family was in, as a result of the Revestment and Mischief Acts, was unfair and unjust. He considered that a contributory factor had been the reports of dishonest servants. He also considered that these men, many of them related, made up the hardcore of an opposition party which was working against him. Seemingly the adversaries were led by Lieutenant Governor Richard Dawson, who the Duke called an adulterous rascal who connived at the prostitution of his own wife, and who held together the various antagonists. They all hate each other. Prominent amongst the Duke's most notable antagonists were the influential Taubman and Quayles families, scoundrels, smugglers who will not leave the Duke a bird's nest in the island by the time they have done with him. Bishop Claudius Criggan referred to the two families as Quayles' arts and malignity and the new House of Taubman. The Duke fell out with his own mother, who he considered was at work with the cursed crew of Taubman and Quayles. A lot of officials and MHKs had made fortunes through their dealing in smuggling, and by extension, slavery. The Taubman and Quayles families were involved in both trades. Thomas Quayle wrote to his father John Quayle, Clerk of the Rolls, in 1781, informing him that one of their vessels, ostensibly carrying Manx red herrings, had been seized in England. This evening was so great, a disaster has happened that the Custom House officers have discovered either 1 or 2 tons of claret on board her. The officer went to the place at once where the wine was concealed. He must have had an informant. Speaker John Taubman had a stake in the slaving voyage of a Liverpool brigantine named Prince Borba. In late 1760s, it called in at Douglas for stores as part of its outbound cargo and sailed on to Angola in southwest Africa, where the goods were bartered for 250 slaves. The slaves were taken across the Atlantic to work in the plantations of Barbados and St. Kitts in the West Indies. The ship then returned laden with plantation goods such as sugar, rum, coffee, tobacco and cotton. Determined and dissatisfied as ever, John Murray, the 4th Duke of Atholl, successfully lobbied to be appointed as governor in 1793. This gave him the advantage of being able to deal with his opponents in the Keys, whilst continuing to protect his remaining interests in the island. If the British government had hoped that by appointing him as governor, it would help heal the bad feelings that had arisen between him and his enemies, then it was very mistaken. And as for the members of the House of Keys, they stubbornly resisted 3 petitions raised in the latter half of the 18th century, calling for them to be publicly elected. And at the same time, their boldness and resolution in taking on the Atholls and their willingness to negotiate with the British government showed great strength of character. With the 18th century ending, it had taken politicians of great ability and purpose to deal with all of this. Call them what you will, the cursed crew of Taubmans and Quayles and members of other Manx landowning and Manx and merchant families serving in the House of Keys would take on the challenging and changing times which now lay ahead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
We have a couple of minutes for questions if anybody would like to ask questions. Anybody?
Oh no, sorry.
Why do you think if the Taubmans and so on were doing representing these like Manx interests so well against the Duke? Why do you think they then resisted popular election or some form of popular election, which obviously on analogy with what was currently in England would get to be fairly restrictive?
Yeah, I mean, all of that. I mean, you have actually asked two questions there, but they both get the same answer. Really. It was all about power and hold. They were the principal landowners on the island and had envious eyes on the land that the Duke had. You know, they wanted to get hold of that. He realised that and was often, as you've heard, in contention with them over it. It was interesting that the governors that they were sending over after the 1700s, moving on into the 1800s, were under instruction to keep him under control. But they had another 30 years of this because he only died in 1830. So it was all about self-interest coupled with an interest for other people in the island. Now, other people on the island are ancestors were out working in the hills, etc., farming. They were unaffected by all of this, whether it was a Lord of Man or the Crown. It didn't affect them at all, really. That answers your question. Maybe not.
Well, yeah, it's probably a set. It's just their different services and their services.
Yes, yeah, you know, they were. The risk was quite low because they weren't smuggling things out of the island into the UK and Ireland. It was other people who they charged to do that. Where the ships sailed from after coming out of the Isle of Man was not their concern. They made certain of that, and they made millions and millions of pounds. And it was you'd think fetching goods into the island, repackaging them, putting them onto boats, fetching them back over into the UK or over to Ireland, smuggling it. That's a fantastic labour-intensive exercise. But as you heard, the customs duties here were so low that it was worth their while.
Could you just say a few words about the process whereby people arrived as members of the House of Quayles?
Well, it was all rather interesting. I don't know if I'm going to answer the question you're asking here, but the fact is it was family after family member after family member after family member who became members of the Quays. Quayles and the Taubmans, the Gawnes and the Moores became members and married into each other's families. You know,
Well, would I be right in thinking that the Quays themselves, when there was a vacancy, nominated two, again, probably other family members, their names went to the Lord, who then chose one of two, and that's how they were self-perpetuating?
You're right there, Mark, yes. And usually, as you say, they nominated two. The convention was, I understand, that the first nominated person that they nominated would be the one that they wanted to get in. It didn't always happen that way, but that was what they were after. So.
Thank you.
Was there any geographical association in this period between being an MHK and where any sense of you came from Peel or you represented Ramsey or
Right. Yes.
was there any association of that nature there?
Linked in with
So did the families have a particular association with the south of the island, or you mentioned about the Moors and Peel and so on?
All right, yeah. The elected MHKs then were not elected constitution by constitution.
No, sure.
They were just representing the Isle of Man. So, you know, it was 24 good men who, as you say, possibly most of them came from the south of the island, because Castletown at that time was the capital of the Isle of Man.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't mind.
As a Taubman and a Quayle.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
You called them the Cursed Crew. Were they named that at the time, or they were?
They were.
So,
Yeah.
so should we be proud of them, or you know?
Well, it's a bit like Ilian Doan, isn't it? You know, was he a hero? Was he a baddie? Were they heroes? Were they baddies? You know, they were just looking after themselves. You know, there wasn't anything unusual. You have to ask the MHKs of today. You know, contrast, compare and contrast. That's an exercise. No, I've answered the question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Taubman and a
I
Quayle.
should say, although I
I should say, when I was in the House of Keys for 20 years, at various times, there was 4 other family members there as well.
There you go, Hazel. I mean, that sums it all up. Thank you.